The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and dying roses. Through the narrow window, I could see the city lights blurring in the rain, each one a small promise of a life I would never live. My engagement ring was gone. The sapphire my grandmother had worn through 2 wars, the only thing she'd left me when she passed. David stood by the door, his shoulders turned away, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in hushed tones to someone who wasn't me. It was just a ring, he'd said 3 days ago, not meeting my eyes. Katherine, you have to understand. The creditors were threatening legal action. I had no choice. But there had been choices. There had been months of choices. The poker games that stretched past midnight, the business ventures that collapsed like paper houses, the friends who needed loans that became gifts. And through it all, I had stood beside him, quiet and faithful, believing that love meant sacrifice, that devotion meant silence. Now I lay in this bed, my body failing from the cancer we'd discovered too late because we couldn't afford the screening, because David had needed the money for something else, something always more urgent than my health. The doctors had explained it in clinical terms. Stage 4, metastasized. Weeks, not months. I'd nodded, absorbing the information like rain into already saturated soil. David ended his call and approached the bed. His face held the expression I'd learnt to read over 5 years. Regret mixed with impatience, the look of a man who wanted to be anywhere but here. I need to go handle some things, he said, already reaching for his jacket. My mother's coming tomorrow, remember? She wants to talk about the funeral arrangements. His mother, the woman who'd smiled at me across dinner tables while comparing me to David's ex-girlfriend, who'd worn white to our engagement party, who'd told her friends I was adequate when she thought I couldn't hear. The woman who would now orchestrate my funeral like a social event she was obligated to attend. Of course, I whispered, my voice barely carrying across the small room. Go. He kissed my forehead. A gesture so perfunctory it felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence neither of us wanted to finish, and left. The door closed with a soft click that echoed through my chest like a final heartbeat. I turned my face toward the window. Rain streaked down the glass, each drop racing others toward an inevitable conclusion. My hand felt naked without the ring's familiar weight, the space where it had lived for 3 years now, marked only by a pale line against my skin. David had sold it to a jeweler downtown, pocketing $8,000 that disappeared within a week. I never asked where it went. By then, I'd learned that questions only brought elaborate explanations that circled around truth without ever touching it. I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she told me when I was young. She'd survived the bombings, the rationing, the years when hope itself was a luxury. She'd worn that sapphire through all of it, a gift from her own mother, passed down through generations of women who'd learned that survival sometimes meant holding on to the smallest pieces of beauty in a world determined to strip everything away. Keep it safe, she'd whispered when she placed it in my palm, her hands trembling with age and illness. It's more than jewelry, Katherine. It's a reminder that we endure, that we're stronger than what tries to break us. I'd worn it every day after she died, feeling its weight as a connection to her strength, her resilience, her refusal to disappear even when the world demanded it. And then David had taken it, sold it, erased that connection as casually as he'd erased every other part of me that didn't serve his immediate needs. The morphine drip hummed beside me, counting down moments in steady increments. I thought about all the words I hadn't said, the boundaries I hadn't drawn, the person I'd erased to make room for his needs. I'd been so afraid of being difficult, so convinced that patience would eventually be rewarded, that silence would be mistaken for strength. But silence, I understood now, was just another word for disappearing. The pain in my chest intensified, spreading through my ribs like frost across a window. I'd stopped pressing the morphine button hours ago, curious about what dying felt like when you let yourself feel it. It hurt, but not in the way I'd expected. The physical pain was sharp and insistent, but Beneath it lay something else, a deeper ache that had nothing to do with cancer and everything to do with the life I'd lived, the choices I'd made, the woman I'd allowed myself to become. I thought about the Katherine I'd been before David. She'd been working toward her master's degree in literature, writing a thesis on women's narratives of resilience. She'd had friends who called just to talk, not just to check if she was still alive. She'd had dreams that extended beyond making herself small enough to fit into someone else's story. Where had she gone? When had I stopped recognizing myself in mirrors? My breathing grew shallower. The room dimmed at the edges, shadows creeping in like guests who'd waited too long for an invitation. I felt my heartbeat slow, each pulse weaker than the last, as if my body was finally learning what my mind had known for years, how to let go. The machines beeped their monotonous rhythm, marking the boundary between existence and release. Through the window, the rain continued its relentless fall, indifferent to beginnings and endings, to lives lived and lost. I wondered if David would cry at my funeral, if his tears would be real or performed for an audience that expected grief. I wondered if anyone would mention the ring, if someone would ask why my hand was bare in the casket. There was no pain now, only a spreading numbness that felt almost kind. The darkness pressed closer, soft and insistent, and I stopped resisting. My last thought was absurdly simple. I wondered if my grandmother was waiting somewhere, if she'd be disappointed in how easily I'd let go of everything she'd tried to teach me about survival. Then nothing. Then darkness. Then silence deeper than any I'd known in life. Until suddenly, impossibly, there was light. My eyes opened to morning sun streaming through gauze curtains, the kind of gentle light that comes before the city fully wakes. I sat up, gasping, my hand flying to my chest to feel a heartbeat that was strong and steady and young. The room around me swam into focus. Cream walls, a desk cluttered with textbooks, a closet with the door half open, revealing clothes I recognized but hadn't seen in years. My apartment. The one I'd lived in before David. Before I'd moved into his place above the restaurant his friend owned. Before I'd started sleeping on a mattress that smelled like someone else's regrets. I stumbled to the mirror, my legs unsteady beneath me. The face that stared back was mine but younger, unlined by illness and disappointment. My hair fell thick and dark past my shoulders, no longer thin and dull from chemotherapy. My skin held colour, life, possibility. But more than that, my eyes held clarity, recognition, the weight of knowledge that didn't belong to this younger face. I touched my cheeks, my neck, my collarbone, confirming the impossible reality of flesh that was whole and healthy. My lungs expanded fully, without the rattle and restriction I'd grown accustomed to. My body moved without pain, without the exhaustion that had become my constant companion. But it was my hand that stopped my breath. My left hand, bare and unmarked, without even the pale line that had haunted me in those final days. I knew this hand. I knew this moment. I knew what day this was. Memories crashed over me like waves breaking on rocks. I remembered everything. The hospital, the rain against the window, David's retreating back, the morphine drip counting down my final hours. I remembered the cancer eating through my organs, the fear that had become background noise, the resignation that had felt like peace. I remembered dying, and I remembered, with crystalline clarity, that today was exactly 6 years ago. The day David and I had planned to meet his mother for the first time at Le Bernardin, the expensive restaurant where she'd made reservations to evaluate whether I was suitable for her son. The day that had begun the long descent into becoming someone I didn't recognize. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't a dream. Dreams didn't have this texture, this weight of absolute reality. This wasn't madness. Madness didn't come with perfect memory of a life lived and lost. This was something else, something I had no framework to understand except the stories my grandmother used to tell about second chances, about women who'd been given the opportunity to rewrite their endings. Time had folded backward, giving me something I'd never thought to ask for, the chance to choose differently. I moved through the apartment in a daze, touching familiar objects with new awareness. The coffee maker I'd bought on sale, still working, the bookshelf filled with novels I'd stopped reading when David said I spent too much time escaping into other people's stories, the plant on the windowsill that I'd managed to keep alive, unlike so many other things, the phone on the counter, silent and waiting. I picked it up with trembling fingers and saw the message notification. David, confirming our lunch reservation at 1 o'clock, adding a note about wearing something his mother would approve of, suggesting the navy dress he liked, the one that made me look presentable and demure, as if my worth could be measured in hemlines and conservative jewellery, as if my purpose was to be a reflection of his good judgment rather than a person with my own substance. The old Katherine would have spent the morning in anxiety, trying on outfit after outfit, seeking an impossible approval from a woman who'd already decided I wasn't good enough. She would have researched his mother's background, memorized talking points, prepared to perform worthiness like an audition for a role she'd never truly win. But I wasn't her anymore. I couldn't be. I carried too much knowledge now, weighted with the understanding of exactly where that path led. To a hospital bed, to a bare finger, to dying alone while the man I'd sacrificed everything for couldn't be bothered to stay. I typed a response slowly, each word deliberate. "Something's come up. Let's reschedule." His reply came within seconds. "Katherine, we can't reschedule. I already told her we'd be there. She's driving in from Connecticut specifically for this." I stared at the message, seeing in it the entire pattern that would define years, his plans taking precedence, his mother's expectations outweighing my comfort, my needs perpetually deferred to some future that would never quite arrive. Every sentence was about what he'd promised, what he needed, what would be inconvenient for him, never once asking what had come up, if I was all right, if there was something he could help with. Another message appeared. "Don't do this to me. You know how important this is." Do this to him, as if my existence apart from his schedule was an act of aggression. I turned off my phone. The silence that followed felt vast and clean, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city move through its morning rituals. People walking dogs, opening shops, starting their days with the assumption of continuity. They didn't know how fragile it all was, how quickly a life could narrow to a hospital room and a bare finger, and the understanding that you'd given everything to someone who'd valued it at $8,000. But I knew, and that knowledge changed everything. Over the following days, I began the quiet work of reconstruction. I didn't announce dramatic changes or make sweeping declarations. Instead, I made small choices that accumulated, like interest. Saying no without elaborate justification. Spending evenings with friends I'd been slowly abandoning. Returning to the novel I'd started writing 3 years ago and never finished. My phone filled with messages from David. They evolved from confused to frustrated to angry. A progression I remembered from my previous life whenever I'd failed to arrange myself around his needs. He didn't understand what had changed, why I was suddenly being difficult, why I wasn't responding to his increasingly elaborate explanations of why my behaviour was unreasonable. "My mother thinks you're playing games," one message read. "She says women like you always make men jump through hoops to prove themselves. Don't be that person, Katherine." Women like me. The phrase resonated with everything his mother had already decided about me before we'd ever met. That I was calculating, manipulative, using her son for status or money or whatever motive she'd assigned to a woman she knew nothing about. I didn't defend myself. I simply continued existing, separate and whole, in a life that was starting to feel like mine again. After a week, he appeared at my door. He looked exactly as I remembered, handsome in the careless way of men who'd learned early that charm could substitute for character, his smile confident, but his eyes holding that edge of calculation I'd once mistaken for intensity. He wore the cologne I'd always found too strong, the leather jacket he thought made him look dangerous and exciting, the entire costume of a man performing the role of boyfriend without understanding the substance beneath it. "Katherine," he said, leaning against the doorframe with practiced casualness. "What's going on? You're acting strange." Strange? The word for any woman who stopped performing predictability. "I've been thinking," I said, not inviting him in, "about what I want, about what I need." "Okay." He drew the word out, waiting for me to explain myself, to justify my interior life as if it required his approval. "And what is it you want?" "I don't think we should see each other anymore." The words hung between us, simple and irrevocable. His face cycled through expressions. Surprise, disbelief, wounded pride. But not, I noticed, actual hurt. Not the kind of pain that comes from losing something irreplaceable, only the frustration of losing something convenient. "Is this about lunch?" he asked, his voice rising. "Because I didn't introduce you to my mother? Katherine, you're being ridiculous. Relationships require compromise." "You're right," I said quietly. "But compromise means both people adjust, not just one person disappearing while the other stays exactly the same." "I don't understand what's gotten into you." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing. "Did someone say something to you? Are you seeing someone else?" The accusation came easily to him, I noticed, the assumption that my choices must be about another man rather than about myself. It didn't occur to him that I might be choosing myself over him, that the alternative to our relationship wasn't another relationship, but simply freedom from one that diminished me. "I'm seeing myself clearly for the first time," I answered. "That's all." "That's not an answer." His frustration sharpened into something harder. "You owe me an explanation, Katherine. After everything I've done for you, everything we've been to each other, what have you done for me?" The question emerged calm and genuine, without anger or accusation. "Tell me specifically, what have you done that was about what I needed, rather than what you wanted?" He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, searching for examples that wouldn't come. I watched him realize, in real time, that our entire relationship had been constructed around his needs, his schedule, his preferences, his mother's approval. That every compromise had been mine, every adjustment had been me making myself smaller to fit the space he'd allocated. "I loved you," he finally said, and the past tense told me everything. "No," I replied gently. "You loved how I made you feel. You loved having someone who asked for nothing and accepted everything. That's not the same as loving a person." I closed the door gently, cutting off his protests. Through the wood, I heard him linger for several minutes, his breathing audible. His presence a pressure I'd once found comforting and now recognized as suffocating. When his footsteps finally retreated down the hallway, I felt something in my chest release. A tension I'd carried for so long, I'd forgotten it was there. The weeks that followed felt like learning to walk in a body I'd abandoned. Everything was familiar, but required relearning. How to spend an evening without checking my phone to see if David needed something. How to make plans without first confirming his schedule. How to exist without the constant background hum of anxiety about whether I was being enough, doing enough, sacrificing enough to prove my worth. I returned to my writing with fierce dedication, pouring onto pages all the words I'd swallowed in my previous life. The novel I'd abandoned, a story about a woman who wakes up in her past with the knowledge of her future, took on new urgency, new depth. I wrote late into the nights, driven by something I couldn't quite name but recognized as essential, as if by writing this story I could anchor myself in this new timeline, make it real and irreversible. I took the freelance editing job I'd turned down before, the one that would have required evening hours David said we needed for couple time, hours that usually meant watching him play video games while I sat nearby, decorating his solitude with my silent presence. The work challenged me, connected me with other editors and writers, reminded me that I had skills and value beyond my capacity to accommodate someone else's needs. My bank account slowly grew, my friendships deepened, the ones I'd been letting atrophy under David's subtle discouragement. My best friend Rachel, who I'd been seeing less and less because David always had something planned on the weekend she was free, became a constant presence again. Coffee dates, movie nights, long conversations about books and ambitions and the lives we wanted to build. "I'm proud of you," she said one evening, curled up on my couch with wine and takeout, for ending it. "I know I never said anything, but, Katherine, you were disappearing. Every time I saw you, there was less of you there." "I know," I said, and I did, both from memory and from the present moment's clarity. I couldn't see it while I was in it, but I see it now. "What changed?" she asked, studying me with the careful attention of someone who knows when to push and when to listen. I thought about how to answer, about explaining rebirth and second chances, and dying in a hospital room 6 years in a future that would never happen now. But some truths were too large for sharing, too strange for anyone who hadn't lived them. "I just woke up one day," I said finally, "and realised that if I kept going the way I was going, I'd lose myself completely, and I decided I couldn't let that happen." It was true enough. Some truths were best told slant. 3 months after our separation, I saw David across a coffee shop. He was with a woman whose laugh carried across the room, brittle and performative. She wore an expensive dress and touched his arm with possessive frequency, and he leaned into her attention with the ease of someone who required constant validation. The woman looked younger than me, her face carefully made up, her posture that of someone working very hard to appear effortless. I felt nothing watching them, not jealousy, not satisfaction, not even curiosity. They existed in a story I was no longer part of, playing roles I'd escaped. He saw me and his expression flickered. Surprise, then something harder to read. I raised my cup in a small acknowledgement and returned to my manuscript. When I glanced up again minutes later, he was staring at his companion with an expression that might have been doubt or might have been the first whisper of a question he wasn't ready to ask. The seasons turned. Spring arrived with determined greenery, painting the city in shades I'd forgotten during my long dying. I finished my novel in April, typing the final words with trembling hands and a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the story, and everything to do with proving to myself that I could finish something, could create something whole and meaningful from my own vision. An agent I'd queried months ago requested the full manuscript, then called 3 weeks later with an offer of representation. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and her voice on the phone carried an excitement that felt genuine, professional, and deeply validating. "Your book made me cry," she said. "Not sad crying, the kind where you recognize something true you didn't know you'd been missing. The way you write about second chances, about reclaiming yourself. Katherine, this is important. This matters." The book sold to a publisher in an auction that felt surreal. Multiple editors bidding, advance money that meant security and validation, and proof that my voice, my style, my story, my perspective had value in the world. I celebrated with friends at a restaurant downtown, laughing over wine and pasta while they toasted my success, my courage, my refusal to settle for less than I deserved. My editor was there, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, who'd fought for my book in her acquisitions meeting, who'd written me an email explaining exactly why she needed to publish this story, how it had resonated with her own experiences of losing and finding herself. Beside Margaret sat her colleague's brother, a photographer named James Sullivan, who'd been documenting the restaurant's reopening for a magazine feature. He had quiet eyes and careful hands, and when he asked if he could photograph me for a series he was doing on emerging writers, I said yes without the familiar anxiety of wondering if I was allowed to take up space. "You have an interesting face," he said as he adjusted his camera, and before I could take offence, he continued. "I don't mean that as empty flattery. I mean, you have the face of someone who's lived more than your years suggest. There's depth there. Story? That's rare." "I'm older than I look," I said, which was true in ways he couldn't understand. "Aren't we all?" he replied, and something in his tone made me wonder what he'd survived to earn those words. Over coffee a week later, reviewing the contact sheets of his photographs, I found myself telling him about my grandmother, about her strength during the war years, about the sapphire ring she'd worn through bombings and rationing and loss, about how she'd given it to me the week before she died, her fingers trembling as she slipped it onto mine. "She told me it had kept her safe," I said, tracing the edge of my cup. Not magically, but as a reminder that she'd survived before and could survive again. That our family was built on women who refused to break no matter how hard the world pressed down. "Do you still have it?" James asked. I hesitated, caught between timelines. In one life, David had sold it and I died mourning its loss. In this life, that hadn't happened yet. But would it? Had my grandmother already passed in this timeline? Or was that still coming? The details felt slippery, hard to hold. "No," I said finally, choosing the truth that felt most real. "I lost it in another life." He didn't ask what I meant, only nodded, as if he understood that some losses exist outside linear time, that grief could be complicated by paths not taken and futures that collapsed before they fully formed. "My mother had a locket like that," he said quietly, "wore it every day until she died. My sister wanted to bury her with it, but my father kept it. Said she'd want it to keep protecting us. He wears it now under his shirt, this tiny woman's locket against his heart." We sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood that objects could carry more than their physical weight, that loss was measured in more than what you could touch. 6 months later, my book released to reviews that exceeded every anxious hope. Readers connected with the protagonist's journey, with her quiet reclamation of self, with the idea that you could wake up one day and choose differently. Book clubs selected it, book bloggers recommended it. Sales climbed steadily, and my publisher scheduled a second printing. I did readings in bookstores where strangers lined up to tell me how my words had resonated, how they'd seen themselves in my protagonist's struggle. Women, mostly, women who'd made themselves small, who'd given up pieces of themselves they were only now learning to mourn. They thanked me for writing their story, for showing them that transformation was possible, that it was never too late to choose yourself. And in those moments, signing books and listening to their stories, I felt the full weight of what my rebirth had given me, not just the chance to save myself, but the ability to offer that possibility to others through words on a page. James attended every local reading, sitting in the back with his camera, documenting not just me, but the faces of readers as they listened. Afterward, he'd show me the photographs, women with tears in their eyes, men nodding in recognition, young people leaning forward with the intensity of those encountering truth for the first time. "You're changing lives," he said one evening after a particularly emotional reading. "You know that, right?" "I'm just telling a story," I demurred. "No," he shook his head. "Stories are never just stories. They're permission. They're maps. They're proof that someone else survived the thing you're going through. That matters more than you know." 6 months after that, James asked me to dinner. not as friends, not as artist colleagues, but as two people who'd been circling something unspoken for months. We went to a small Italian place in a neighbourhood I'd never explored, and over wine and conversation that flowed like water finding its level, I felt something I'd forgotten was possible: ease without performance, intimacy without erasure. He asked about my writing process, about what had inspired the book, about whether I believed in second chances literally or just metaphorically. Both, I said, surprising myself with honesty. I think sometimes life gives us opportunities to choose again, maybe not as dramatically as my protagonist experiences it, but we get moments, chances to correct course, to become who we should have been all along. And you took yours, he said. It wasn't a question. I do, every day. When he walked me home, he didn't ask to come up. Instead, he took my hand at my doorstep, his thumb brushing across my knuckles with a gentleness that made my breath catch. I'd like to see you again, he said. Not as colleagues, not as friends, as whatever we might become, if you'd like that too. I would, I said, and meant it with a certainty that came from knowing exactly what I was choosing, from having lived the alternative and understanding what real partnership could look like versus what I'd accepted before. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on conversations and mutual respect, and the radical notion that love should add to your life rather than require you to subtract from yourself. James had his photography, his exhibitions, his own complete life, and he made space for me in it without asking me to abandon mine. We attended each other's events, supported each other's work, celebrated each other's successes without competition or resentment. A year passed, then another. My second book sold, then my third. James's photography gained recognition, exhibitions in galleries that attracted crowds and critics. We moved in together into an apartment with high ceilings, and light that transformed throughout the day. Space enough for both our work and our lives. And gradually, carefully, we built something that felt less like romance from movies and more like partnership between equals. Two people who'd learned that love wasn't about one person diminishing to fit another's needs, but about both expanding to accommodate each other's fullness. On our engagement day, chosen deliberately, no surprise proposal that took the decision out of my hands, James presented me with a small velvet box. Inside lay a sapphire ring set in platinum, the stone deep blue and ancient, its facets catching light like trapped starlight. "It's not the same one," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of all our conversations about loss and memory. "I know it can't be, but when I saw it in the estate sale, I thought of your grandmother, of survival and strength, of the women in your family who wore their resilience like armour, of you." My hands trembled as I lifted it from the box. The stone was the exact shade I remembered, that deep twilight blue that seemed to hold entire oceans. The setting was different, more modern, more delicate, but the essence was the same. It felt like a gift from the universe, a restoration of what I'd lost, a closing of the circle. "It's perfect," I whispered, and it was. Not because it replaced what I'd lost, but because it marked what I'd found. Not a recreation of the past, but an honouring of it. A bridge between who I'd been and who I'd become. I slipped it onto my finger, feeling its weight settle like a promise kept to a version of myself who'd died believing she wasn't worth saving. Who'd let her grandmother's legacy be sold for $8,000 and a man's convenience. This ring was proof that some things could be reclaimed, that some losses could be transformed into different kinds of wholeness. "Yes," I said, answering the question he hadn't yet asked, but we both understood. "Yes to everything you're offering. Yes to building a life together. Yes to choosing each other every day." The wedding was small, intimate, filled with people who celebrated us rather than judged how well we performed gratitude for their presence. Rachel was my maid of honour, crying openly during the ceremony. Eleanor attended with her husband, beaming with pride like I was family rather than client. Margaret brought flowers from her garden. James's father wore his late wife's locket and told me I reminded him of her. Fierce and gentle in equal measure, he said, which was the finest compliment he knew how to give. My friends gave toasts that made me laugh and cry. Eleanor read a passage from my first book about second chances and the courage of choosing yourself, her voice breaking on the final lines. James's vows spoke of partnership and respect and the kind of love that makes space rather than demands it, that celebrates who you are rather than who you might become with enough modification. And I stood there in simple silk, my grandmother's sapphire, or its spiritual successor, on my hand, feeling the weight of 2 lifetimes converging into this single, perfect moment. I was marrying a man who saw me, valued me, chose me not in spite of my complexity, but because of it. I was surrounded by people who'd witnessed my transformation and celebrated it. I was holding a career I'd built with my own hands and words. I was, for the first time in either life, completely myself. But the past, I would learn, doesn't release its hold so easily. 3 months after the wedding, I was signing books at a store downtown when I saw him. David stood at the back of the line, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that had shed weight and vitality. The confident posture I remembered had collapsed inward, shoulders hunched as if against a wind only he could feel. His hair had thinned, premature grey threading through the dark. His face held the kind of weariness that comes from fighting battles you keep losing. I kept signing, kept smiling, kept engaging with readers who'd come to hear me speak, but I tracked his progress through the line, with the awareness of someone who'd once memorized his patterns, his moods, his capacity for taking up every molecule of available air. Finally, he reached my table. Up close, I could see the changes 5 years had carved into his face. Lines of bitterness around his mouth, shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes held a desperate quality that made me simultaneously pity and resent him. "Katherine," he said, my name rough in his throat like he'd been practicing it, preparing for this moment. "David," I kept my voice neutral, professional. "Would you like me to sign a book?" He faltered, his hands empty. "I didn't come to buy a book. I came to see you." The woman behind him in line shifted impatiently, and I held up a hand to the bookstore employee, asking for a brief moment. "All right," I said, still seated, looking up at him with the calm of someone no longer afraid of another person's emotions. "I'm listening." I made a mistake. The words tumbled out, rehearsed but desperate. "Letting you go? I didn't realise what I had until—" He stopped, regrouped. "I've been following your career, the books, the success, the wedding announcement in the Times. You look happy." "I am." "I thought we'd get back together eventually," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken, as if my happiness was just an intermission in a story that was supposed to return to him. "I thought you'd come back when you got this phase out of your system, but you didn't. And now—" He trailed off, his eyes dropping to my hand where the sapphire caught the bookstore's fluorescent light, blazing with the kind of fire that only comes from stones that have survived centuries. His face went white, the blood draining so completely I thought he might faint. "That ring," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Where did you get that ring?" I looked down at it, at the stone that had somehow found its way back to me across time and choice, and the determined work of a man who understood that the best gifts honour what someone has lost. The sapphire seemed to pulse with its own light, a talisman against everything I'd survived, everything I'd escaped. "My husband gave it to me," I said simply, letting the words land with their full weight. "For our engagement. But I sold." David's voice cracked, his composure fracturing completely. "I sold yours, your grandmother's. I needed the money, and I thought it was just jewelry. That you'd understand, that you'd forgive me like you always did, like you forgave everything." Understanding settled over me like snow, cold and clarifying. He didn't know. He couldn't know that I remembered that other timeline, that other life where his choices had killed me slowly, where I died in a hospital bed with a bare finger and a heart full of regrets. He only knew this version, where I'd walked away before he could take everything, where I'd protected myself before the damage became irreversible. And now, seeing the ring on my hand, not the same one, but one that represented everything he'd casually destroyed, he was finally understanding what he'd lost. Not just me, but his chance at a life built on something real, something that might have sustained him through the failures that were clearly accumulating in his wake. "I did understand," I said quietly, my voice carrying to the readers still waiting in line, all of them now silent witnesses to this moment. "That's why I left, because I understood exactly what my value was to you, what everything's value was to you, measurable only by how it served your immediate needs." "Katherine, please." He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back smoothly, deliberately, the sapphire catching light as it moved. "I've changed. Everything fell apart after you left. The business ventures failed, all of them. The restaurant deal collapsed. The investments I made with your ring money, He stopped, hearing how even now he was listing reasons why I should care about his suffering rather than acknowledging what he'd done to cause mine. But he pressed on, desperate. "My mother, she got sick. Cancer, lymphoma. We spent everything on treatments that didn't work. I had to sell her jewelry, the house in Connecticut, everything, and even that wasn't enough. She died last year, and I had nothing. The creditors, the lawsuits, I lost everything trying to save her. I lost everything, and I finally understood what it feels like to have something precious taken from you." His voice broke on the last words, and I saw real pain there, real grief. But it was the grief of consequences, not the grief of genuine understanding. He mourned what he'd lost, not what he'd taken. He wanted forgiveness, not because he grasped the depth of his betrayal, but because he needed relief from the weight of his own regret. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Not sorry enough to offer comfort, but sorry that anyone had to learn this way. Sorry that growth so often came wrapped in regret and rage, and the bitter medicine of natural consequences. But that's not my burden anymore. You made your choices, I made mine, and we're both living with the results." "You can't mean that." His voice rose, drawing more attention from other customers, from the bookstore staff, from everyone in this space that was mine, that I'd earned through words and courage and the refusal to stay small. "After everything we were to each other, you're just going to act like it meant nothing?" "It meant everything," I said, standing now, meeting his eyes across the table that separated us like the border between lives. "That's exactly why I left. Because I learnt that I deserved better than someone who measured my worth in how little space I required, how few needs I expressed, how completely I could erase myself to accommodate his comfort." The bookstore employee approached gently, reading the tension, asking if everything was all right. I nodded, smiled, and she escorted David toward the exit as he continued speaking, words spilling out in increasing desperation. Apologies and justifications and promises that came 5 years too late to matter, that rang hollow against the evidence of who he'd been and, from all appearances, who he still was. I watched him go, this man who'd once held the power to destroy me, now reduced to a supplicant seeking mercy from someone who no longer defined herself by his approval. And I felt, instead of satisfaction or triumph, only a deep, quiet peace. The weight of his suffering was not mine to carry. The burden of his regret was not mine to relieve. I had built a life beyond him, beyond the space he tried to confine me to, and watching him leave this bookstore, my space, my achievement, my triumph, I finally understood the full measure of what I'd reclaimed. The line resumed. I signed books and chatted with readers, present and engaged, while some distant part of me observed how completely I'd shed the skin of that earlier self. The Katherine who'd died in a hospital room, robbed of everything, including her grandmother's legacy, no longer existed, and the Katherine who'd walked away before that fate could solidify had transformed into someone neither version could have imagined, whole, successful, loved, free. That evening, I told James about the encounter. We sat on our balcony as dusk settled over the city, his hand wrapped around my thumb unconsciously stroking the sapphire that marked our promises, our partnership, our choice to build something together rather than one person building while the other disappeared. "Do you regret it?" he asked, not giving him another chance, not offering forgiveness. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty, with how little conflict remained around the question. Regret requires believing I made the wrong choice. I made the only choice that let me survive, that let me become this. I gestured at our apartment, at the city spread below us, at the life we'd built together. Forgiving him wouldn't have changed him. It would only have convinced him that his behaviour was acceptable, that consequences could be avoided with enough charm and desperation. He nodded, understanding in the way he always did. Not because he could read my mind, but because he'd learned to listen to what I said instead of waiting for permission to speak, instead of deciding what I should think or feel or need. "He'll carry this," James observed quietly, "the knowledge of what he lost. For the rest of his life, every time he sees your name on a bookshelf or hears someone mention your work, he'll remember that he had you and threw you away. That's his punishment, not anything you did to him, but what he did to himself." "I know." I leaned against his shoulder, feeling his warmth, his solidity, his choice to stay without needing to be convinced or accommodated or made more important than he was. That's his story to carry, not mine. I have my own story now. Months passed into years. My books continued selling, readers connecting with stories about women who chose themselves, who learned that survival sometimes meant walking away from everything familiar. David's name occasionally surfaced in social media, a bankruptcy filing, a failed marriage to the woman I'd seen him with in the coffee shop, bitter posts about how the world rewarded the wrong people, how talent and loyalty went unrecognised while those who played games and abandoned commitments thrived. I didn't block him or seek updates. I simply continued living, writing, loving, building a life that felt like mine, rather than a performance for an audience that would never be satisfied. I wrote 2 more books, both bestsellers. I taught writing workshops. I spoke at conferences about reclaiming your narrative, about the courage it takes to choose yourself. And with every year, with every achievement, with every morning I woke up beside James in our sun-filled apartment, I felt the past grip loosen just a little more. Sometimes, late at night, I would twist the sapphire ring on my finger and think about the girl I'd been. Both versions of her, the one who'd died and the one who'd chosen differently. I thought about how close I'd come to repeating every mistake, how rebirth had come not through magic, but through the simple, radical act of saying no, of drawing boundaries, of believing that I deserved more than scraps from someone else's table. And I thought about my grandmother, who'd worn her stone through bombings and rationing, who'd survived when surviving seemed impossible, who'd passed it to me with a blessing. I'd only now begun to understand that protection wasn't about avoiding pain, but about remembering that you could endure it and still remain yourself, still remain whole, still remain worthy of the space you claimed in this world. On the 5th anniversary of my first book's publication, Eleanor threw a party at a gallery in Soho. The space filled with friends, colleagues, readers who'd become friends, the community I'd built one choice at a time, one boundary at a time, one act of self-preservation that had felt selfish until I understood that self-preservation was just another word for survival. James had photographed the evening, capturing moments of laughter and connection, the warmth of being seen and valued, the simple joy of existing among people who celebrated your presence rather than tolerated it. He'd mounted some of the photographs for the exhibition, a series called Becoming, documenting my journey from that first book reading 5 years ago to this moment. I stood before them, studying the progression. In the earliest images, I still carried traces of tension, of uncertainty, of someone waiting for permission to take up space. But with each successive photograph, I saw the transformation. Shoulders back, head high, smile genuine rather than placating. By the final images, I looked like someone who knew her worth, who claimed it without apology, who'd learned that the opposite of selfless wasn't selfish, but self-possessed. Near midnight, I stepped onto the gallery's terrace for air. The city spread below, lights marking thousands of lives being lived in ways I'd never know. Somewhere out there, David was living his story, whatever shape that had taken, whatever lessons he'd learned or refused to learn. And somewhere in the universe's accounting, 2 timelines existed, one where I'd died small and forgotten in a hospital room, and one where I'd chosen to live large enough to fill the space I'd been given. The door opened behind me. James joined me at the railing, sliding his arm around my waist in the easy way of long partnership, of love that didn't require performance or proof. "Happy?" he asked, the question he'd asked me countless times over the years, never assuming, always checking, always making space for whatever truth I needed to speak. I looked down at my hand, at the ring that had somehow found its way back to me across time and choice, at the promises it now represented, not just between James and me, but between myself and the girl who'd died believing she wasn't worth saving, who'd let her grandmother's legacy be sold for someone else's convenience, who'd made herself so small she'd nearly disappeared entirely. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like freedom, like forgiveness, like the sound of a door closing on everything I'd survived to leave behind. Completely. Below us, the city breathed its night rhythms, indifferent and eternal. And somewhere in that vast indifference, I found the final grace I'd been seeking. The understanding that happiness wasn't about revenge or justice or watching your enemies suffer. It was about waking each morning in a life you'd chosen, surrounded by people who celebrated your existence rather than tolerated it, doing work that mattered, being exactly who you were meant to be. David would carry his regret until his final breath. I knew this with certainty, had seen it in his eyes that day in the bookstore. He would watch from the margins as my success grew, as my happiness expanded, as the woman he'd diminished beyond recognition transformed into someone he could no longer touch or diminish or erase. That was his punishment, not pain I inflicted, but truth he finally understood too late. And me? I would carry nothing but my grandmother's ring and the knowledge that I'd survived twice, once by dying, once by living. And between those 2 survivals, I'd learned the most important lesson, that the greatest revenge is becoming so completely yourself, that the person who tried to erase you becomes a footnote in a story that was always meant to be about reclamation. The night air stirred around us, carrying city sounds and distant music. James's hand found mine, fingers interlacing with the ease of practice and choice, and standing there above the world that had tried to break me, wearing my grandmother's blessing, held by someone who knew my worth without needing to be convinced of it, I finally understood what she'd meant when she said the ring would keep me safe. It hadn't protected me from pain. It had protected something far more precious. The knowledge that I could survive. It could transform it, could emerge on the other side still whole, still myself, still worth every ounce of space I claimed in this world. And that, I understood in that moment of perfect clarity, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.